In fact, this afternoon, he leaves for South Africa, where he'll be working on projects there. He has worked in Africa, on the continent, in various countries. He's worked in India. And it all started with working in the drone journalism lab here, and then taking his experience from the drone lab and realizing that drones encourage you to learn more about mapping and more about 3D and more about augmented reality and virtual reality. And now he does all of that. A bunch of ways of immersive storytelling that Ben is going to be telling us about. So thank you, Ben.
All right, so what I'm going to be talking about are projects that I've done, tools that I've been using, and also questions that I've been asking myself throughout this whole process. Because the way that I work primarily has been independently. So as a student, I was working with the Drone Journalism Lab, but I graduated in 2013, and since then most of my work has been as a freelancer. And I'm interested in how emerging technologies can be used for storytelling. So I've done a lot of work in journalism, which I'll show some examples of, but I also go far beyond journalism into conservation, working with artists, sometimes producing sort of new media art myself. But when it comes to the journalism side of things, I'm really interested in telling old stories from new perspectives and telling stories that perhaps we weren't able to tell before because we didn't have the right tool. So technologies are just tools. Drones are just tools. Virtual reality is a medium, and the cameras that you use to produce, those are just tools. And at the same time, these new tools open up new creative possibilities for journalism, for storytelling, for creating art. And a lot of times it involves new ways of allowing your audience and people that are consuming or engaging with your content to engage with it and to interact. I've also done some work quite playful with sensors. So on the left, the flashlight can pick up Wi-Fi signals and let you listen to what the sounds of Wi-Fi and our mobile devices make the frequency activity. So I can't listen into phone calls, but I can listen to what all of these ghost frequencies around us sound like. The project on the right was actually a journalism project funded by the Tao Center at Columbia in New York. And those are basically luggage trackers. You put this package of electronics into a suitcase and it'll tell you the story of a piece of luggage. So it was a bespoke sensor kit that could ride along in a suitcase and tell the story, or tell a story that I couldn't tell because I can't fit into my own suitcase. So I like playing around with using technology to go places where perhaps people can't go. But on the note of, if you've ever wondered what Wi-Fi sounds like, that's Wi-Fi. So that repetitive sound, that is literally the sound of Wi-Fi. If you plugged in the headphones into my flashlight, you could listen to that. And so this is just kind of an offshoot of some of the sensor journalism work that I've done. And this was actually presented at a sound art conference in Copenhagen back in 2015. So I actually was creating compositions using mobile devices and my special flashlight that picked up radio frequency activity. So that came out of journalism. All right. But the tools and mediums I work with, like I mentioned, and like Gary mentioned, drones, 360 video, spatial audio, 3D virtual reality, a little bit of augmented reality, getting more into that now. But the principles, again, storytelling comes first. Technology is just a tool. So fill your toolbox. And frugal innovation. So if you have an idea, if you want to make something, just go make it. Go try it out. Go prototype. Go play with the idea. A lot of times it's easy, even today, to get bogged down in planning out the intricacies of what you're trying to do. And in reality, the tools are out there in many cases. Thanks, office. Yeah, you can go out and get started. And as you're working, as I'm sure many of you know, as you're working on a project, it kind of unfolds as you go. And when you're working with new ideas and new tools, it's easy to get bogged down when things aren't working. But at the same time, as you continue to develop the tool that you're working with on the project that you're working on, it tends to come together with patience. And there's been a lot of patience in working with projects with a variety of different organizations, international development projects. I was the first fellow at BuzzFeed's Media R&D Lab in San Francisco back in 2015. That was the one time that I was full-time employed. And I decided to leave and go back to being independent afterwards because I like working on a variety of different projects with different people. So interdisciplinary learning is really important to me because I can learn something working with archaeologists that I can take back to journalism. And I'll show an example of that in a little bit. But it did get started with drones and sort of capturing the world from a new perspective, the perspective that the drone can provide. So some of the earliest work that I did with the Drone Journalism Lab and Matt Waite, who'll be talking tomorrow, some of that early work was in India, so doing aerial photography. So this massive flowers and color, there's a man on there, and he's the groom at a wedding riding on a horse. Another shot, the scale of the world changes when you're using a drone. So there's an enormous amount of creative potential. And some of the work that I did in India was with the Times of India. So linking up with their photographers, shooting sporting events especially, that worked real well for the drone. And they even published me as a part of the coverage. But then moving on to East Africa, did a lot of work in 2014 in Kenya, working with CCTV News, working with African Skycam, doing video work like that about wildlife and wildlife conservation. But again, playing with what the drone can provide. So this here is a herd of wildebeests. And what I loved about this shot was from that height of about 400 feet, the herd becomes this sort of cellular organism. So it changes the scale completely from what we're used to on the ground. And the drone allows you to capture these interesting interactions with animals. So again, access. Using technology and tools for access and drones for access. That's something that I keep going back to. So that shot of the giraffe, when I was working with a wildlife guide, I showed that shot to him, and his response was, working as a wildlife guide, I've seen a lot of photos and a lot of videos of giraffes, but I've never seen a giraffe like that. And watching that clip, it felt like seeing a giraffe for the first time because of the interesting interaction between drone, camera, animal. So like I was saying before, these tools can open up stories that perhaps have been told in the past and maybe have been told a lot, but because of the radically different perspective that the tool, the technology provides, you get an entirely different experience with that story, an entirely different form of engagement. Speaking of engagement, there's 360 video. So when I was at BuzzFeed, it was right before the big sort of VR boom and the hype explosion around virtual reality. So it is what it is. 360 video, it's a highly immersive, transparent medium. At least in terms of 360 video, yes, you cannot interact with the environment, but you can put goggles on and you can look around, and it's kind of like you're there. So we had some great success over there, or when I was working at BuzzFeed. And so I adopted the 360 camera into my toolkit. So this is kind of sort of a typical look at what I might be carrying in my gear and what I've actually got packed up right now to go to Cape Town. But you know, we've got drones, we've got 360 drone, 360 cameras. There's even a stereoscopic VR 180 if you're familiar with that. So it's like stereo 3D video, but you can look around sort of a half sphere. It hasn't really caught on, but it's more of an experiment. But again, a lot of this is experimental. In fact, my first 360 camera I built, which is this one, which is taped together and used on a sort of industrial rubber band and 2 GoPros. And it actually worked. And from that initial sort of hacked together prototype, I built a 3D printed version, which went on to this drone. And so when I was at BuzzFeed, I was working on this kind of stuff. Those drones were still real new, and 360 video was very new, and mashing them together, well, that was a lot of fun. But also, we were what I was trying to do was create tools that were accessible for people. So at the time, this was 5 years ago, we had the Ricoh Theta S, which was an early 360 camera, but the video quality was really poor. So we needed something better for BuzzFeed. And so I made the kit. I put it together from GoPros. There's no reason that you would build this today, which I'll show much better, higher quality examples of cameras. But the point is you can build your tools. If you have a 3D printer, if you want to make something, maybe the tool doesn't exist and you have to sort of mash up your own configuration of the hardware. Well, you can do that. And a lot of times it's pretty simple. If you have a 3D printer or access to a 3D printer. And usually what I'm doing is stuff like this. I'm doing little modifications to off-the-shelf hardware. So I'll take a drone, maybe I'll extend the legs or just remove the legs entirely. So I'm not building drones. Early on in the drone lab, which Matt might talk about tomorrow, we were building drones, but you don't need to do that anymore. But you can still modify them to do tasks that perhaps they weren't built to do out of the box. So again, there's that 360 video drone, and it worked. In fact, the video that we produced with it, although the quality is quite poor, granted this was about 3 years ago, this video, which is posted on Facebook, it was one of the first 360 videos on Facebook, and it was the first 360 video that BuzzFeed published. And it has gotten over 6 million views. And it got about 3 million views in the first week. So you can make your tools and you can actually create content and people will actually watch it. Although it does help to be at BuzzFeed, given their viral machine. But what I like to try to get across is you can build tools and then you can use them out in the field and they actually work. Another example, rapid prototyping. So the problem with that drone that I just showed in the last shot was you could see it. If you look up in the 360 video, you have the drone legs. Well, I wanted to get rid of the drone entirely. So you would have this seamless flying experience using the drone in 360 capture. So to prototype it, I used 2 pieces of foam and 2 GoPros. And the GoPros are slightly modified with aftermarket lenses. And then that evolved into this here. So it's a DJI Mavic. Some of you are probably familiar with it. I'm using these Kodak cameras now, so you don't have to modify cameras. I actually sell the 3D printed mounts if you want the mount. If you want to make this, and I'll show you what it does in a moment. But if you want to make this and you have a 3D printer, I can give you the files. That's open source, but if you want, you can also buy the parts. So I actually sell parts to make and modify tools. Let's see. Okay. So this was shot with that drone here. Sort of an example of what. So as you can see, it's a seamless 360 sphere. It's captured by the drone, so you can fly around and get footage like this, which happened to be this eroding cliff line just south of San Francisco and Pacifica. So that's what that drone can do. And you can't buy a drone like that off the shelf. So if you want to do drone 360 video, you still have to make your own tool to do it. So there's modifications involved. So if you're interested in 360 and drones, be prepared for that. I'll share this briefly, sort of to make a point about the medium. So early on, the BuzzFeed team was using these 3D printed camera rigs like you see here. One of the projects they did was with the San Francisco Giants. So kind of behind the scenes, going to the locker room, the broadcast booth. You know, this could be cool. And it's probably been done now, but like at Memorial Stadium, where you can go places where most people can't go. And you can, like here, we actually gave the camera to a player as they walk out onto the field. But the point here is this. So the people liked it, right? So the medium of 360 is interesting because you might have an idea for what you're going out to tell, what your story is, but people will get whatever they want out of it. And that's the beauty of it, is it's open to that kind of interpretation. And that kind of engagement, which in some ways isn't necessarily as easily done with fixed frame video. So if you're doing journalism, if you're doing storytelling, keep this in mind, where you might be intending to convey one thing, but people will get something completely different out of it. And I love that. So that was fun. Briefly on hardware right now, this is kind of the non-really high. If you're doing really high-end commercial work, you'd be using a camera that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. But for most journalists, most people going into the field, they're using something like this, like the Insta360 Pro, which it's still pretty expensive for a freelancer. But these cameras are great. So if you're interested in getting into 360, I highly recommend any of these. You're basically splitting hairs if you want to pick apart which one's better. I have the E360. I think it's great. I actually think that the footage can be surprisingly close to what that $3,200 camera can do. So these cameras are great. The Insta360 One X is a really interesting camera, and it ties into the weird situation, I'll say, around the sort of VR hype that's happened. So that camera, it's a 360 camera that'll capture a kind of immersive video, but it's marketed as an action camera. And it's marketed so that with this idea that, for example, if you have a GoPro, you're only seeing what the GoPro is facing, right? Well, with this camera, what they built software-wise is you can track action that's happening around you. So it's like you have this all-seeing camera that can produce video like a GoPro, but it's not a GoPro, if that makes sense. So for example, if they have this great sort of demonstration of what the camera can do, and it fits into this kind of football thing. And they have a skateboarder clearing a gap. So he's jumping over the space, and somebody throws the camera through that gap. And in the final video, you can see the skateboarder. In the software, you can track the skateboarder going around you. So the point is it's not just for doing 360 video. It's for doing really kind of dynamic moving shots or following action that's happening, where maybe you can't take a fixed frame camera and follow everything, if that makes sense. So it's a really interesting tool for doing different kinds of video work. And it also gets at the problem or the challenge that the VR sort of hype, the challenge around the hype of VR, in the sense that not everybody has VR goggles, not everybody's consuming VR content. That's an issue. A lot of people recognize it. So what they're doing, which is really smart, is saying, we can use a 360 camera to produce video that you could watch just as a fixed frame video on, say, Facebook or YouTube or whatever. And the camera at the same time can do some really interesting technical, it has some really interesting technical features. So the hype is definitely real around 360. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing, and I'll throw this out there real quick, if you're interested in sort of the high-end stitching, these cameras all come with their free software for stitching video. But this is what I use and what a lot of people use for sort of high-end, more customized post-production workflows for 360. So anyway, going back to this issue around 360 and VR and maybe the hype around it. As a result of that, I started doing 360 in journalism, but have since pivoted a lot towards development and doing projects where there's a very specific focus where we know who the audience is. So the challenge with 360 and VR in journalism is sort of the general audience, or most of your given readers or users or consumers, they're not going to have VR goggles. So the New York Times sent out 1 million Google Cardboards, but it's a novelty. The cardboard is kind of a novelty, and most people don't have a sort of proper, real VR headset. So that's a problem if you're producing content that's made for that kind of interaction. So the projects that I've been working on over the past couple of years have begun to get more into development, where we're doing projects where we know who the audience is. We're able to put goggles on the faces of people. So it's more of a quality over quantity experience. So if you're interested in getting into 360 and VR,
you really have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? Who's your audience? And if you're able to answer those questions and be really clear about it, there are some really great applications, like in education. I'm working on a project with Australian Aid and Second News and the Innovation Exchange, all those guys in the South Pacific, where there's a VR element, but it's in the classroom, and we're bringing in the headsets for students to use. So you have to be really careful at times how you work with emerging technologies, especially when you consider who your audience is and how they're going to engage with the content. So that's that. A little bit more, because I like making stuff. On that project, so we did a project in Tanzania around some aquaculture work, and of course I had to make some tools when I was there. So I love making my kit. So you can do underwater 360, and there's a 3D printed sort of cube that you can use for your cameras on Shapeways. Shapeways is a really great resource for buying 3D printed parts for stuff, whether it's drones or camera mounts. It's basically people like me who have made something and then they're selling it to other people who want to kind of modify their off-the-shelf hardware. So there are lots of sellers selling all sorts of sort of high-end 3D printed tools and pieces on a Shapeways. So it's a resource worth knowing about. And then again, if you do 360 video, I encourage playing with it a lot. So not just putting a camera on a tripod. Working on that aquaculture project, we put cameras on the back of a motorcycle, on the back of a truck, underwater, on the drone, trying to minimize stable tripod shots and get the camera moving through environments, because it's an immersive medium. So let's go on a little trip and not just stand still. When to use the medium? If space is a major part of the story. So right now I'm working on a project with the National Science Foundation, and it's all about figuring out how immersive media can be a useful tool to organizations to connect, say, operations in the field to the boardroom, which doesn't sound that sexy, but again, 360 video and VR is a very powerful tool. The question is, how do you best use it? And we're still figuring that out. And I think the trick really is figuring out the tool side of it and who can benefit from the medium as a tool. And then when to reconsider, you have to be in the middle of the action, basically. So like we did a protest piece at BuzzFeed. There was a Trump rally in San Jose. And one of the reporters went out into the middle of that. And it was a great story because you're right in the middle of the chaos. So being in the middle of the action is necessary, or the middle of the space. Briefly on spatial audio, this technology has been around for years, mostly in the sort of high-end sound world. But spatial audio, meaning if you put on the headphones, when you move your head, if you're wearing VR goggles, again, you need the goggles, the sound changes. So the orientation of the sound, just like when we naturally in the world move our head and the orientation or the direction of sound changes, you can do that with sound and media. That's a great low-cost mic to get started with. Reaper is a digital audio workstation, which is a great way to produce that audio. And then Facebook has their free tool for sort of bringing the video, the 360 video side of the audio together. But now we got to go to Turkey and talk a little bit about archaeology. So this is Birol Can. He's a professor from Turkey who's actually doing research here at UNR right now because his colleague, this guy right here, Michael Ha, the two of them have been working at Antiochia ad Kragum, this archaeological excavation on the southern coast of Turkey, for a number of years now. And they had a problem. So again, technology, tools, they can solve problems. They were using fire truck booms and forklifts and chains to hang themselves over what they were excavating. Michael actually nearly hurt himself really badly hanging from a forklift once. So the drone was a much safer way to get the footage that they needed and the images. And we're able to do this. So I'm going to play this again because this is important. to me at least. What's happening here, this is video, this is drone video. I'm flying around this excavated site. And this is a 3D reconstruction of that site, of the same location. And this is what we've been doing over there. And we've been using drones starting off like this, which I put together. So using a bottle cap and an L bracket and some hardware store hardware, I mounted this camera to the bottom of the drone. And using that drone, there's a close-up. I love the bottle cap. It was able to, this tool, it was thrown together. It obviously wasn't made, the drone wasn't made to operate like this. And that's just a Canon camera. What's happening here is this setup, and I'll talk about how this happens in a moment, but this tool set is able to produce these 3D models from photos, only from photographs. So, and not only that, so you can create three-dimensional environments from photography, from photos. It's amazing. It's really magical. So you can create these 3D models like here, and then I use Sketchfab, which if you're into 3D modeling or if this type of work is catching your interest, take note of Sketchfab, because Sketchfab is like YouTube, but for 3D content. So you can upload your models, you can embed them into web pages, blogs, social media. But anyway, these 3D environments can become virtual reality environments. So the archaeologists can now go to the site in VR and actually walk around it using the drone produced 3D environments. So, and this is a giant, one of the largest mosaics in the region. These are just sites from the archaeological excavation imaged by my drones. So emerging tech works well together. And I'm just, again, nowadays I'm using off-the-shelf hardware. I don't recommend modifying your drones like that because you don't need to at this point. Let me skip ahead here. Okay, so this is what's happening, and I think the process is key here. So how do you take photos and create a 3D model or a 3D environment or 3D reconstruction? Well, you take a lot of photos, and you use a process called photogrammetry, which has been around for well over 100 years, because it's essentially a mathematical process of measuring points. The point is you can create these kinds of 3D reconstructions. And with software, instead of using a ruler and making mathematical measurements, you can make these kinds of really interesting content. And so the process essentially boils down to image overlap, where you take images. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica for Children, illustrating photogrammetry as a concept. Each of these squares is a photograph, and you can see they're overlaying one another. So if you take photos and they overlap, so if you have an object and you're imaging the object with overlap, you can create a three-dimensional reconstruction of the object. So like this. These are photos of a sunken church in Ethiopia. So I took images like this. It's just lots of images. I'm kind of scanning whatever it is that I'm interested in capturing. And in the end, I have a 3D model. That's the end result. So just from photos, you can use your cell phone, you can use a DSLR, a Micro Four Thirds camera, a drone camera. You can create stuff like this. And so it's a pretty interesting way of doing 3D storytelling, making it accessible too, and using drones at the same time. Mobile device friendly, of course. And one kind of odd project we did at BuzzFeed, a reporter did a story about Jeremy Bentham's severed head, and she had taken about 16 photos of the head, and I got a hold of them and fed them into my software, and out came 3D of his head. So she had just published photos in her story, but this was another way that you could show that object. The software that you use to process this, so you take the images, now you have to feed it into these magical pieces of software, which will literally take your images and turn them into 3D. They all work pretty much the same. If you're interested in doing this work, I would talk to me more or do some research online. I like reality capture. Agisoft PhotoScan is the industry standard. That's what surveyors have been using for many years, and archaeologists as well. So, and then if you fly the drone, if you want to bring the drone into this, there are apps. So basically you program your drone to fly autonomously. So it becomes your little worker. And so you sit there and you just watch it work. And it's pretty cool. If you do, and this is where that interdisciplinary work comes back to the surface again. So let's say you have your 3D content and you want to create a VR experience. Maybe you want to create an experience for the browser, but that involves your 3D content. Well, now we're talking more about game design. And so we're using game engines, so like Unity, the Unreal Engine. So in sort of one project, you can apply journalistic principles and knowledge. You can apply the drone side of things. You get into game design. So we're kind of all over the place here because everything kind of bleeds together in really interesting ways. And when to use 3D reconstructions. Again, when space is an important part of the story, and you can engage with the content, whether it's in a VR environment, whether it's online in Sketchfab. I do want to show one example. Got out of line here. Yeah, this. Okay. So a project that I did in Nairobi. Should be. Yeah. Okay. So an example of when I used this in practice, I was doing a project with Vice, a reporter from Vice News, about this landfill in Nairobi, and he was doing a short documentary about the landfill. And so he wanted a drone to be able to capture these kinds of views of the scale of the dump site in Nairobi. And so the drone was a great tool for that, of course. And there it is. So I had my hacked together pile of junk drone, but then I wanted to create a 3D version of the landfill. So I used that drone and created this 3D model of it, which is, of course, on Sketchfab. But anyway, so this allows you to sort of be the drone. You become the drone and you can fly around, and you can add annotations so you can point out where important artifacts or important parts of the story are. You can also have audio, photos, so there's still photos within here. So it's a different way of telling a story using 3D, and it does ask something of the audience, though, of your user, the consumer, because they have to engage with it. It's not just you sit there and it kind of hits you. You have to play with it. Anyway, to finish up, one project, if this kind of volumetric photogrammetry stuff is of interest to you, I recently was on a team. So there's Journalism 360. I'll take a step back. There's Journalism 360, which is all about sort of supporting immersive media in the journalism space. So I'm an ambassador with Journalism 360, and I'm also on a team that we recently won a grant. We're called Volume, and what we're doing is we're creating an open source capture kit that will let you do sort of time-based video 3D models, if that makes sense. So like if I had my capture kit up here, I can move around and record myself talking, and then there would be me recorded in 3D moving around. So it's still early stages, but there's a lot of interesting work happening in the 3D volumetric space, which ties into virtual reality, augmented reality, where you're dealing and working with 3D objects. And in this case, if you want to have moving 3D objects to be able to capture life, some form of life that's moving, people in different ways are working on those kinds of camera and capture tools. So that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Any questions? Anyone? Yep.
So Ben, what would you say are your unique characteristics that have gotten you into this whole range of thing? Because, you know, at the end where you're saying, well, we use game machines and we're using photogrammetry and we're using drones and we're using photography and what ways of thinking brought you to this, I guess? You know, what are your qualities that got you into this wide range of stuff that all comes together in such a great storytelling package? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the most basic answer, which isn't very interesting, is curiosity. But underneath that, it's asking the question. It's asking questions like, why is this interesting? How can people use this? I have no formal engineering background, but I'm always interested in solving sort of mechanical problems in an engineering type way, where I like to talk to people and say, what are you working on? What problems are you having? What help do you need? A lot of times it's that. And at the same time, I'll have those conversations, then I'll have other conversations. For example, I was talking with a professor. I spend a lot of time on campus when I'm in Lincoln talking with people about what they're doing, because I'm curious about how people are using technology to do their work. So for example, I was showing those examples of 3D reconstruction photogrammetry. There's a lot of that work happening on a campus. So not only the work that we're doing with Michael Hoff and art history, but there's actually a project on East Campus where they're doing reconstructions of meat. So they're imaging meat as part of this educational program. So my point is that it's something to do with this curiosity that drives you to want to know not only more about the subject, but how people are approaching that, whatever it is that's of interest. And I think I've just hit on this weird formula that works, because I've made my career out of doing this stuff, which I never planned to do, and I was never taught to do it, but I was just curious about it, and I wanted to work with these tools which excite me, and based on that passion and curiosity, and even though I might not seem like it up here, but even though I'm introverted, going out and talking to people about it, talking to people about what they're doing, about what I'm interested in, what I'm doing. So making stuff, sharing it with people, and talking with other people who are passionate about it. And I think the one recipe for success that I've struck upon is, if you're excited about something, whether it's any of this stuff or something else, that when you work with somebody, perhaps they're doing something different than you. So for example, my background is not in art history or archaeology, but when I work with those guys, I get their passion. I get that they're excited about this, and I get what they're trying to do. And so when we talk, we meet halfway, because I have my own skills, and we kind of feed off of each other's passion and curiosity for what we're doing, and out comes this really great work. And that happens time and time again with all these projects that I end up working on. So it's finding those people you get along with and can connect with somehow, where what you do is complementary to what they do. And as a freelancer, that's, I think, really crucial.
Good.
Hi. So a lot of your stuff looked like your hardware looked pretty hacked together.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever lost anything really big, like dropped a camera in the ocean?
Yeah, well,
and I'm also curious if you've ever put a lot of effort into a project that didn't pan out, that you didn't end up finishing.
yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so there's a story that Matt Waite likes to tell about the first drone that we had in the drone journalism lab. I lost it in the Platte River because something happened, and there it went down into the river. So I lost one drone. Something happened to it, some kind of electrical, mechanical, I don't know what, right on the border of Nebraska and Wyoming, and it just slowly descended and was gone. And that was that. So yeah, I lost that. But otherwise, no. And to your second question, it's interesting because there's two ways to answer that. One is the way that I approach a project. So I showed that landfill project, right? there were really two goals. The primary goal was to shoot drone video. That was pretty straightforward. I knew how to do that. The hardware, we were using a GoPro, and that was straightforward to do that. Now, the 3D modeling side of reconstructing the landfill, I wasn't sure how that would come together. So that was kind of the experiment, which could fail. And it didn't fail, it worked. But what I'm getting at is when I do a project, especially if I'm working with journalists and I want to do something different or sort of experimental, I always do something that I know we can do. So I know we can go out and we can do this one thing and that'll be good enough. If that's all we do and part B fails, it's fine. As long as we have part A and that came together, that's great. So I kind of work like that. I make sure that we can always knock out one crucial element, and then I go for the bonus stuff. And the bonus stuff tends to be the more experimental, to me, kind of interesting part of it. But when you have that kind of model, you can't really fail. And in the end, too, usually the part B, the experimental work, it usually works in some ways. I've never had just something that just flat out doesn't work. So it might not be what you're expecting, but that's okay. The point is that you learn something, and in most cases you get something that's either workable or you can kind of build off of it, if that makes sense. So no, I've never really had an outright failure, but it's because of that way of approaching the work. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. Great presentation. I had a question for you in terms of all the different experiences that you've had. How have you dealt with any ethical issues that have arisen? Mm-hmm. And do you have tips for folks in terms of what to consider in terms of immersive storytelling, as there have been instances in the past recently of how to approach this ethically and considering the audiences? So if you could share some insights on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so my perspective has always been pretty, I'd almost say conservative, in the sense that I go to, for example, with immersive storytelling, I go to the NPPA Code of Ethics, so the National Press Photographers Code of Ethics. And I actually had some slides in here that I took out talking exactly about this. Basically, if we are doing sort of capital J journalism, I leave the tripod in. I don't mess with the visuals. I've had debates with people that say, it's immersive storytelling, you should remove the tripod, but it's actually there in the capture. And I like to go with the standards that already exist and basically take the ethical standards that we've been following with earlier tools and apply them to what we're doing now, with the realization that might change. So I think in some ways I've kind of loosened up about, say, editing tripods out of shots, that kind of thing. I've heard of some pretty bizarre examples of, there was a project where there were translators sitting on a rock and somebody was being interviewed and the translators were edited out of the shot. And I thought, whoa, that's not right. And that's also kind of it's sort of betraying the medium in a way, because if you think about it, virtual reality or 360 video, of course the terms are interchanged, is about capturing a moment as it happened. And when you get in, especially if you're doing journalism, and if you're doing that kind of heavy-handed editing, that's not excusable. So there's that range. Editing people out of shots because they're not part of the story, I can't do that, obviously, because of those sort of ingrained ethical standards. But then you have stuff like editing out tripods and sort of the detritus of the recording process. I tend to be pretty conservative, or have been in the past, but I'm open to evolving and becoming more open to, say, editing footage, but through having discussions about it. So I don't know. I continue to, I don't really have a firm stance on some of those issues, because I think that as a new medium, it deserves to have these kinds of conversations where we shouldn't just carry over everything the way we've been doing it, but at the same time, that's a good place to start. And it's still pretty early for doing this kind of 360 VR capture. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
All right, thanks, Ben. And I think that's a great element to stop on. Ben will be around if people want to chat a little more. And we come back at 2 o'clock with the